Well, hello, xenographers everywhere, and welcome to another episode. This week, we've got a very special lens indeed. It's the boss of blur, the czar of swirl, the Mr. Big of Bokeh. This week's lens is none other than the Helios 40 85mm f1.5. And when it comes to unusual and characterful background blur, this lens is the one to beat. It's got a great reputation and it's become something of a cult lens for photographers and movie makers alike. With a maximum aperture of f1.5 and a focal length of 85mm on full frame, plenty of background blur is pretty much guaranteed, but this lens doesn't just give you blur, it's a swirler. In fact, it'll give you more swirl than any other lens that I know of. If you like the swirly stuff, this one could be worth a look. According to the research I've done, it's either a direct copy of or heavily derived from the 1930s Zeiss Biotar. Whatever the case, the lens is very highly regarded, so I was very much looking forward to using it. Now, you can buy these lenses new in Nikon and Canon mount, but this one's from 1963 and it was made for early Zenit SLRs. Later versions have a black body and an M42 mount, while early versions like this one have an M39 mount and need a step-up ring to mount to an M42 adapter. It focuses down to 80 centimeters, so because it's a longish lens, that means you really can get quite close, and that's a useful feature. There's no doubt that this is a big and heavy lens. It weighs in at 1 kilogram, so it's quite heavy to carry around. In fact, it's so heavy that the manufacturers fitted it with a tripod mount all of its own. This isn't present on the new versions, although I think they are a little bit lighter, so maybe it's not needed. On the Sony A7, the lens looks and feels big. Of course, on mirrorless, because it's an SLR lens, the adapter adds an inch or so to the length, but even on the Zenit 3M, without an adapter, it's a big old piece of glass, so it might not be the ideal walk-around lens if you like to travel light. The quality of construction is generally very good, and although this example dates from 1963, it wears its years pretty well. The focus ring turns nice and smoothly. It does have a fairly long throw of 3/4 of a turn or so, and that can be a little bit awkward in some situations. But on a lens with such shallow depth of field as this one has when it's wide open and close to the subject, it can be very useful too because it gives you fine adjustment. Just like the Helios 44, this lens has two aperture rings. One has clicks that you set your chosen aperture with, and one is stepless. And that one was designed to quickly open the lens for focusing and then close down to the aperture that you've pre-selected with the clicked ring when you want to shoot. The glass on this one seems in beautiful condition and it's clearly been well looked after over the years. The preset aperture ring is a little bit rough. I think it needs a bit of lubrication, but it works fine. There's no oil on the blades, but there is a little bit of wear on them. If you do need to service this lens, it's said to be one of the easiest, though I've never serviced one myself, but I have done lots of Helios 44s and they're very simple indeed. So this one may well be similar. So what's it actually like to use? Well, I think I mentioned earlier it was heavy. Well, it most certainly is heavy. Walking around for a day with this lens, I realised pretty quickly how heavy it is. I was even a little bit worried it might damage the lens mount or just overstress it a little bit. So I carried the camera underneath the lens rather than letting it just hang off the camera. That said though, it's much like any other lens to use. Setting the aperture might take a little practice if you're not used to a preset lens, but it's all pretty straightforward. It's said to be a low contrast lens, wide open, and it is, despite that lovely purple coating on the front element. The slightest hint of direct light in the frame causes contrast to drop dramatically, and maybe that's not surprising given its 1930s origins. It's easy to fix in post, but if the low contrast look isn't your cup of tea, it's probably best used with a hood. If there's no direct light source in the frame though, it's a very different story. In these conditions, contrast is actually pretty good. Better to my eye than the Helios 44, the Jupiter 9, the Zuiko 100mm 2.8. It's as good, if not better, at least in my opinion, than the Zuiko 135mm f3.5, which is quite an achievement for such an old design. It's also said to be a bit soft, wide open, and it has to be said that it's not as pin sharp as some other lenses, especially at the edges. For me though, as I've said about lots of lenses, it's sharp enough, and if you stop down to f2.8, it really does sharpen up quite a bit. Now, an area where this lens really does excel is colour rendition. I love the way it renders colour. It's one of the nicest, possibly the nicest vintage lenses that I've used in this regard. It makes colours really pop. It's not subtle like the Jupiter 9. This lens paints its colours proudly. They're bold, bright and saturated, much nicer than the real world. These are the colours of magical realism, and everything looks that bit more eye-catching, that bit more saturated than colours do in reality. Strong primary colours become stronger, autumn leaves become more autumny. Colours are saturated without being garish or cartoonish. Like Kodacolour Gold, it makes the whole world pop, and it's definitely one of the best features of the lens. The first black and white images I shot with it, I was a little bit disappointed. They seemed a little bit washed out, a little bit lacking in tonal range, a bit flat. They needed a bit more punch. But those images were shot on a cloudy, overcast day, and when I shot again on a day with strong sunlight, it was a very different story. Suddenly, the lens had the old school look that I liked so much on the Jupiter 9. Very rich tones with strong blacks, whites and greys. Some of these images I thought were really quite nice. They've got a shine, they've got a sparkle that black and white images from some lenses just don't. They're rich and strong, they're punchy and bold, and of course the unique signature look of this lens works just as well in black and white as it does in colour. And what a signature look that is. This lens has become widely celebrated for it, and I really can see why. Shooting close to the subject, background blur is considerable to say the least, and shapes and forms in the background all but disappear. Everything just merges into everything else, and you're left with a great big blurry wash that's very soft and very gentle, looking kind of like skillful work with an airbrush. No need to worry about distractions in the back of a shot, as there aren't any, just vague cloudy shapes that enhance the subject and direct attention towards it. At further subject to camera distances, there's still plenty of blur available, though it falls off with distance. It's a little less smooth, although it doesn't ever seem to become too harsh or unpleasant, and there are times when the conditions are just right, when it becomes quite magical, and under those conditions it gives some of the nicest background blur I've seen from any lens. Depth of field is so thin that only certain elements are in focus, others are just out of focus, and still others are completely out of focus, so we end up with an image that's partly realistic and partly impressionistic, a sort of merging of two different painting styles that, to my eye at least, is absolutely beautiful. Auteur film theorists have sometimes been known to use the phrase, "the director paints with light," and really I think that phrase applies to this lens. It does kind of paint with light. Some of these images do have something of the quality of paintings. Some of them have an abstract quality, but the real party trick of this lens is swirl. It's a swirler. This lens swirls more than any other lens I know, and if, like me, you like a bit of the swirly stuff, this lens will not disappoint. As long as you're roughly 3 to 10 feet from the subject and the background, preferably a natural background, is about 6 to 12 feet from the subject, swirl will happen. With this lens, it's not so much about making it swirl as stopping it swirling. Its little brother, the Helios 44, is a known swirler, but this one does it much more readily, and I think it's a rather nicer swirl as well. And while it can be a little bit bold and in your face, it can also be very delicate, giving the subject a beautiful background and bringing a touch of magic to a shot, making reality into magical reality. This is a unique lens, and I don't know of anything else quite like it. It's massive, it's heavy, it's ugly, but it's beautiful. It's engineered like a piece of military hardware. It's big and manly, but it makes some of the most beautiful and delicate images I've seen. There are plenty of other lenses that will give you plenty of blur, but no other lens I know will give you blur with the same character or the same signature look. Modern lenses give lovely soft blur with all the convenience of autofocus, but by and large I find them a bit bland, a bit lacking in character. I much prefer a lens with a unique look, and this lens has the most unique look I've ever seen. As far as cost goes, this one seems to sell for between £250 to £300, something like that. So for a vintage lens, it's not particularly cheap, but then again, as lenses go, it's not particularly expensive either. They are quite thin on the ground though, and there don't seem to be that many around at any given time, so if you want one, be prepared to wait for the right one. They are available new though, so supplies won't run out anytime soon. After using this lens for a while, I've got to say that I'm hooked. It's got fantastic colour and rich punchy black and white. The 80cm minimum focus distance means you can get pretty close to your subject. The aperture's so wide it can almost see in the dark, and the swirly Bokeh is possibly the nicest I've seen from any lens. The only drawbacks are its size and weight, and to be honest, they are quite significant drawbacks. This lens is not easy to carry around all day, and it soon starts to feel heavy and cumbersome. But that's all I can say against it, and my advice would be, if you can, try it. I don't think you'll be disappointed. So that's all from me for now. Don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell before you go. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for a spot more Zenography.